Support for this episode of I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere is made possible by the Wessex Press, the premier publisher of books about Sherlock Holmes and his world. Find them online at wessexpress.com.
I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, episode 169, Studies in Starrett.
I hear of Sherlock everywhere since you became a chronicler.
In a world where it's always 1895, comes I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, a podcast for devotees of Mr. Sherlock Holmes, the world's first unofficial consulting detective.
I've heard of you before. You're Holmes the meddler, Holmes the busybody, Holmes the Scotland Yard Jack in office.
The game's afoot as we discuss goings-on in the world of Sherlock Holmes enthusiasts, the Baker Street irregulars, and popular culture related to the great detective.
As we go to press, sensational developments have been reported.
So join your hosts, Scott Monty and Burt Wolder, as they talk about what's new in the world of Sherlock Holmes.
You couldn't have come at a better time!
Welcome back to I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, the first podcast for Sherlock Holmes devotees where it's always 1895. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
And we will be studying our hearts away in this particular episode as we talk to a guest who has graced our show with his presence once before and is doing so once again on an important anniversary. We'll get to him in just a moment, but first, we wanted to remind you that this episode is available at ihose.co/ihose169. That's ihearofsherlockeverywhere.com. And you can find us at I Hear of Sherlock on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can leave us a comment via email or on that show notes URL that I just shared. The email is comment at ihearofsherlock.com. And of course, phone in a comment, 774-221-READ. That's 774-221-7323. Or, if you are the enterprising type, record something on your phone as an MP3 file and email it to us. Whatever works, we're flexible. We'd also like to remind you that show support is not necessary, but it is appreciated. We make it available through Patreon and PayPal. Just check out those buttons directly on our site. Any amount that you can give helps us to produce the show. We are pleased to be joined by none other than Ray Betzner. You may remember Ray as having appeared on I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere on episode 61, all the way back in February of 2014, in tandem with Susan Rice. Our topic during that episode was Vincent Starrett. And we have Ray back to talk about Vincent Starrett, but from a very different perspective. And we'll get into that in just a moment. Just as a reminder from Ray's biography on vincentstarrett.com, he tells us that because he failed his driver's test twice at the age of 15, and then finally passed and immediately drove to the McKeesport, Pennsylvania branch of the Carnegie Library. And it was there on the lower shelf where the dust tended to collect that he found two books that would remain constant companions for the next 4 decades. The complete Sherlock Holmes with an introduction by Christopher Morley and The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes by Vincent Starrett. That, of course, brought Ray into the orbit of the Baker Street irregulars, the Sherlock Holmes devotees who gather each year in New York, and, of course, in the realm of Vincent Starrett's Agony Column in the Chicago Tribune. Ray, welcome back to I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere.
Well, thanks, Scott. It's a real pleasure to be here, and it's an honor to be asked to talk a little bit more about Vincent Starrett. I do want to make it clear at the outset that my driving has improved. So don't worry about that.
That is true, and you know you don't necessarily have to avail yourself solely of the public library anymore, because you have quite the considerable library at home, from what I see posted from time to time.
I have. So for most of the time since I first became aware of Vincent Starrett, I would pick up odd volumes here and there, and often they were the battered non-dust jacket copies that I would find, $5 books that I bought for so many years at library book sales and church sales and places like that. But it wasn't until about maybe about 10, 12 years ago that I really started seriously collecting Starrett, and at least in part, it came as a realization that I had spent a lot of my early years being a miniature John Bennett Shaw, just kind of accumulating everything that came up that had a Sherlock Holmes face on it. And after a while, that lost its luster, and I also came to recognize that I was never going to have a first-class Arthur Conan Doyle collection, that the values of the books were simply just outside my reach. And after kind of casting around for something that I enjoyed, that I could spend a little time and maybe just a little treasure on, Vincent Starrett obviously came to mind. I had been reading his books all these years. As you said, The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes was my gateway drug into the Sherlock Holmes hobby. And so why not go out and see if there were other books out there that I would enjoy. And so for the last 12, 15 years or so, I've been building first I refused to call it a collection because I had no rhyme or reason to it. I called it an accumulation. But it has become more directed over time, and I do have a nice little library that sits right behind me from where I'm sitting right now.
Excellent. Well, you've put your finger on the nub of what I think a lot of collectors, not just Sherlockian collectors, but collectors overall, discover, and that is, when you're passionate about a subject, it's important to not diversify, but actually narrow your focus and become as specific as you can and become as expert as you can within that specific focus, rather than, as you say, trying to become another John Bennett Shaw who took, 221 boxes worth of things packed into a couple of trailers to get up to Minnesota with his collection.
That's right. I admire John a great deal, but he had major advantages over the rest of us. He started a lot earlier than the rest of us, and he also had the proceeds from his oil and funeral business to help finance his passion. So, and he was maybe Peter Blau is as voracious a collector as John was. But, John was absolutely desperate to try to get everything he possibly could. I remember once he and I were on a phone conversation, and I had it was in the springtime, and it was just before Easter, and I'd asked him if he had one of the Inspector Hector chocolate bunnies that Palmer had created for that season, and he said to me, "What color is the eye?" And I said, "Well, I've got one that's pink." He said, "Well, they're variants, you see, because Palmer has 3 different companies where they're making them from, and one is pink, and one is red, and one is blue. I need a blue one. Find me a blue one." So, but I think the ages of the collectors who can just go out there and buy absolutely everything are probably over.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned Bennett Shaw having a head start on you, or on entire generations of us, really. What made you think that making your collection specifically about Starrett would give you an advantage? And why Starrett, and why not, say, Morley, for example?
Yeah. Well, it wasn't so much an advantage. I felt a certain sympathy for Vincent Starrett. While I am by no means in any way nearly as talented a writer as he is. He and I did start out both in the newspaper trade, and so I felt an affinity for him that way. He, in his writing, spoke to something that he expressed what I felt about the Sherlock Holmes stories in a way that was far more effective than anything I knew I would ever write. And it was that attraction that led me to believe that there's an affinity here between him and I, although we never met. As for Christopher Morley, Steve Rothman has cornered that market and done it quite well. And I can't imagine anybody else trying to do the same thing that Stephen has done. And there are others who have specialized in other areas of Conan Doyle or the Sherlockian world too. So there weren't many folks who were collecting Vincent Starrett. Susan is a greater expert in Starrett than I am, although she's not a collector.
Right.
Richard Sveum, Dr. Richard Sveum up in Minnesota, has an extraordinary collection, but he doesn't write about it much. So, that's the one distinction that I could kind of claim as my own, which is not just having these books, but a desire to show them off. I live in an area. I don't live in central New York or even central Philadelphia for that matter. So it's tough to get people to come out and take a look at my collection. But I can pull my collection out and show it off online. Yeah. And that's been a big part of what's driven me over the last 5 years.
Yeah, well, let's talk about that, because you are a professional communicator by trade. You mentioned having that. The core of the writer and journalist within you. I think that's a fine parallel with Starrett, but you're at home behind the keyboard, and I think to a certain extent most Sherlockians are. We're certainly very facile readers, but we also tend to be very good writers as well. So, what sparked you, and when? To say, you know what, I want to start putting some of this stuff online in some form or function.
So, I was looking at other blogs several years ago and watching how people were talking about their interest in Holmes and particular elements of it. And I was also listening to I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, and listening to you and Bert, and in many ways, the two of you share your fascination and your love for Holmes through the podcast that you do. And I wasn't going to create another podcast. You guys were doing it quite well. So it seemed to me that a blog devoted to largely the books that I've picked up over the years, and the connections that I could make among them for readers, was an interesting idea. The other idea, and I haven't mentioned it yet, and I really should, is I wanted others, especially those who were younger and kind of coming up in the Sherlock Holmes hobby, to have some sense of who Vincent Starrett was. I'm closer to him in age than they are, and I can kind of relate to some of the things that he wrote about and some of the things he talked about and did. But, folks who are in their 20s and 30s are even farther removed from his era. So I wanted to make sure that there was some way in which they could tap into his writing, his abilities, his creativity, and help to understand why it is that he was so influential, especially in those early years of the Sherlock Holmes movement in the United States.
Well, that makes great sense. And it's encouraging to note that the site, the blog, which you can find at vincentstarrett.com, and we'll have links to all this stuff in the show notes afterwards. But that started in January of 2014, which is exactly when Bert and you and Susan and I all sat down together in the players to have that discussion about Vincent Starrett.
Right. And that was also one of the inspirational moments. I enjoyed that conversation so much. Again, I couldn't create quite that experience of having a conversation, but I could, through the blog, offer observations, information, and what I dearly love to do is to take 2 or 3 things that seem slightly disconnected in Starrett's life and show how they're related to one another, and that's always a fun thing too. So, yes, as you know, although your listeners don't, I hounded you mercilessly for your advice on recommendations on platforms to use, and you saw some very, very early versions of it and didn't wince too badly, at least over email, and you were very encouraging, and that was very kind, and I do appreciate that.
Well, that's the thing, and I think there's always room for more, and this is the philosophy of the world of Sherlock Holmes. Really, there's room at this table for anyone who wants to show up with something intelligent to say and something neat to share, and you've got both of those, and that's part of what fascinates me about your site is this journey, not only through your library but through your eyes, because you take us into old bookstores, you take us overseas when you were on visits, you take us into Starrett's journal or notebook, the timeline of his life. It's really an all-encompassing approach to essentially the collection you have, but that, as you say, that connects to itself throughout and connects back to some of the moments in Starrett's life.
Yeah. So here's one adventure, and if you wouldn't mind an example of what you're talking about. My wife and I went to Alaska several years ago and wound up the trip in Vancouver, which was a delightful city. I was in a used bookstore there. Didn't find anything right away. Went up to the proprietor and told him I was interested in Vincent Starrett. And Vincent Starrett. Yes, I think I got something about that, but I can't find it right now. And he went rummaging around his store, and I went rummaging around his store. Couldn't find it. So I gave him my card, and I walked out the door, and I'm starting down the hill, and he comes racing after me, Mr. Betzner. And he found it. And he hands me a book, and I recognize it instantly. It's a Vincent Starrett's first book of poetry. It's called Banners of the Dawn, and it's a really beat-up copy. And I had already had a couple copies, including one that's inscribed by Starrett to somebody else, and so I hated to disappoint him after he went through all that work, but I said, well, I've already got a copy, and he said, yes, but do you have the copy that he inscribed to his mother?
Oh, man. Oh, my gosh.
And he opens it up, and there on the front end paper is the inscription, which reads, Dear Mother, I hope you will find much to applaud and little to disapprove in this, my first collected volume of verse. Love to you at Christmas, Charlie, 1922. So Charlie, his first name, his true first name was Charles. Family members called him Charlie all of his life. The name he used for a lot of his writing was Vincent. So we negotiated a price. I bought it. And as I am walking away, he says, now you have a mystery to solve. And I said, what's that? He said, how did this book get to Vancouver? So,
have you
the
solved
Starrett
it?
family spent, I've solved it. I think at least I think.
Here we go.
The Starrett family, started in Toronto. They moved when Starrett was a young boy to Chicago, and that pretty much was his base of operations for the rest of his life. His mom came from a deeply religious family, and especially in her later years, she became what I think Starrett would agree was a bit of a religious fanatic. And she would go on these missions to Vancouver, where they would help spread Christianity among the native peoples there. The through the help of some of the Sherlockians in the Vancouver area, I was able to learn the rather sad ending to the story, which is that his mother committed suicide. Oh. She jumped off of a ferry boat. Oh, dear. And probably had taken this book with her during that time. And she had a relative living in the area, and I'm assuming that the relative got possession of those things that she had, and at some point those things were sold off, including this book, and they wound up in McLeod's bookstore and waited for me to come and pick it up.
You know, it's funny because I recently read a piece online, and I can't remember if it was The Atlantic or one of the other journals, but it was a woman who has a passion of going to estate sales. And you know, we are in estate sale season right now as spring kicks off, and every weekend there's a yard sale or estate sale. And she was very careful to say an estate sale is different from a yard sale. At a yard sale, you have access to the things that people decided are not important to them anymore, or that have no value to them anymore. Whereas an estate sale is a going out of business sale of someone's life. And when you walk through a home, and it's usually staged in the home where the collection or the goods are from, you can look around and make observations. And you can tell yourself a story as you walk through this home of what the person was like, or how their life evolved and potentially ended. There was one, she was showing some pictures online where it was a very sparse garage. There was a lawnmower that looked like it hadn't been used in quite a while, and then standing next to the lawnmower there were two walkers. You figured it was a his and hers, and it was where, their declining years happened. And, you think about that with respect to a story behind this book of poetry that belonged to Starrett's mother. And, absent the help of any other Sherlockians, you could have come up with any number of explanations that would have filled the gaps. But how poignant and how heart-wrenching in some ways the actual story was, and how much more meaning it lends to that book coming into your very hands. It's a treasure. I mean, there's absolutely no doubt about it. Starrett's father died when he was a young man. His mother lived longer. I think he felt a greater affinity to his father and his father's family. They were a little bit more raucous and joyful. The mother's family was very strict religious and, deeply frowned upon the kinds of activities that Vincent enjoyed, such as getting together with friends and having the occasional sips of brown beverage and smoking and writing for the pulp magazines. His mother didn't approve of pulp magazines, and she tried to get her husband, Robert Starrett, to convince Charlie that he shouldn't be reading them. So her husband picked up the pulps because he needed to know what it was he was being upset with. And soon he was as much addicted to them as his son was. So she lost out because the two of them became great fans of the mysteries in the pulps that were very popular during that era. So you mentioned having received some assistance from other Sherlockians in solving this mystery behind this particular book. As you've written on the site over the last 5 years, there must be other requests or flags that you've kind of flown asking for assistance along the way. What's another example of something that maybe came to your attention that you weren't expecting, or that someone helped you to connect the dots on?
Well, one of the most generous gifts that I've received as a result of this blog is a album of family photos that a descendant of Vincent Starrett gave to me. And it was a few years ago, I was speaking at the anniversary dinner of the Hounds of the Baskerville Sick up in Chicago, the Sherlock Holmes group that Starrett helped found. And she was, along with my wife, the guest for the evening. And she came in with this album that had been her grandmother's. And her grandmother was Starrett's youngest sister. And she said, I've essentially, I've been reading your blog. You talk more about Vincent and have told me more about him than I knew. And you would appreciate this far more than anybody else. And she handed me this album of family photos that have just absolutely invaluable pictures in them, and they've been scattered throughout the blog since. So, for example, I did a post about Starrett's second wife, Ray Latimer, and Ray remains kind of a fuzzy individual if you read through Vincent Starrett's memoirs. Born in a bookshop, she's mentioned. But is not deeply in focus. And she was a beautiful young woman. The two of them fell in love when Starrett was still married to his first wife, Lillian Hartzick. And so Starrett, in those days, getting a divorce was not an easy thing. And he worked to get a divorce from his first wife. Ray felt increasingly insecure about his love for her. She had other emotional issues, and as a result, he didn't write much about her. But she was clearly the love of his life. The one time in his life when Vincent Starrett had money, he had sold the plots of his mysteries to Hollywood, and one movie, which is a really lousy movie, was made out of one of those stories. But nonetheless, he had money, and so he booked a round the world trip for two, and he took Ray with him, and the two of them went around the world for 2 years. They came back. He eventually got a divorce from Lillian, but Ray's insecurities were profound, and he found he could not leave town for long periods of time. It's one of the reasons why he never went to more than one meeting of the Baker Street Irregulars.
Interesting.
Yeah. So those photos really helped to bring Ray into focus. There are postcards that he sent back to his family from when he was covering the Mexican uprising in 1914 and 1915 as a reporter, war correspondent for one of the Chicago newspapers. There are pictures of him at various stages of his life, including a couple of childhood photos. There are pictures of him with a dog that his family member jokingly called the Hound of the Baskervilles. So it's great insight into his life and his adventures, and that was something that was completely unexpected, but came about as a result of my talking about other items that I'd had the pleasure of owning over the years.
That's pretty amazing. And, you never know where some of this stuff is going to come from, or where generosity may poke its head up. And certainly that's not why you're doing this. You're doing it very clearly for the love of the topic, for the love of Starrett and his works. What are some of the other things that you're particularly passionate about in your collection that have made their way onto the site?
So I try to get as close to kind of the original of something as I possibly can. I don't, no Sherlockian worth their salt is unfamiliar with Vincent Starrett's sonnet 221B. I was able to acquire the manuscript for one of his later books of poetry. And in that book of poetry is 221B exactly as it came out of Vincent Starrett's typewriter.
Oh, wow.
Other than his kind of writing it out longhand and handing it to me, I'm not sure you can get kind of closer to the original there. It's a thrill to take it out and hold it and recognize that this single piece of paper was what kind of started something that's become a tradition among Sherlock Holmes societies all around the globe, and something that unites us because it speaks to the romance and the love that we have for these two characters and the friendship the two of them share.
Yeah. Well, that's remarkable. And in our previous episode 61, you called it the universal benediction of Sherlockian societies, because we've all taken to reading it at one point or another during our gatherings. It's really become that inextricably associated with the Sherlockian movement.
Yeah, and often it's kind of the last thing that's read at a Sherlock Holmes meeting. So it's the last kind of formal bit of business before everyone disperses out into the foggy night. So it has it also kind of summarizes again kind of the feelings that often go on at these gatherings and the reasons why we are there.
Do you have a sense from a timeline? Even if it's estimated, when that tradition began to spring up?
That's a really good question. The poem was he sent it to so he dedicated the poem to Edgar W. Smith. He wrote it in March of 1942, I think.
Yeah, I think that's right.
I should know that off the top of my head. But anyway, he sent it to Edgar and, March 1942. He sent it to Edgar and Edgar loved it. And it wound up in what essentially it was a Christmas card with a poem by Christopher Morley. It was called Two Sonnets, and was sent out to their friends. If you have a copy of that Christmas card, you are very fortunate indeed. It was printed for the first time by one of the other founders of the Hounds of the Baskerville Sick, writer by the name of Charles Collins, who had a regular column called A Linotype or Two in the Chicago Tribune. And it had a little bit of a popularity then, and then it seems to have faded. It popped up every once in a while in a publication or two, but it did not seem to it seemed to be the Hounds of the Baskerville kept it alive. Okay. They were the ones who seems to have read it most frequently, and perhaps some of the other Chicago science societies did too. If you did, let me know. But it was John Bennett Shaw, I think, who was literally the Johnny Appleseed on this, because John, as you well know, had these series of Sherlockian conferences all around the country for a little over a decade, and at every one of these he would have a dinner, and he would end each dinner banquet with a reading of 221B. It did show up in the BSI program, so far as I know, until Tom Stix became head of the Baker Street Irregulars. I can't find it in any of the programs that Edgar did, and I don't know about Julian when he led the Baker Street Irregulars. But certainly by the time Tom led the BSI, it was becoming an almost permanent portion of the program, and then people went back home and spread it among their local science societies. And I have translations into a number of different languages. In fact, Maria Fleischig oversaw e-book publication of 221B translated into a number of different languages not long ago. It is at least as popular today as it was when he wrote it, and probably, frankly, far more popular today. It's certainly the last line or two is extraordinarily well known and quoted and repeated over and over again in news stories about Sherlock Holmes.
Wow. And I have to think that Starrett must have been pleased that his little effort here, all the way from back in 1942, took on such a life during his lifetime. I mean, there was a recording of a set of short stories that Basil Rathbone did, and that included a reading of Starrett's 221B. So to hear essentially your Sherlock Holmes, this would have been the epitome of Sherlock Holmes in the field of acting at the time. Read your poem in such a dramatic fashion must have tickled him to no end.
Yeah. He and Rathbone were pretty good friends. They, as so many people did, they had a corresponding friendship. Didn't travel much at that point in his life, but when people would come through Chicago, they would stop and meet with him, and certainly Rathbone did on a couple of occasions that Starrett records. And he was very flattered that during his later years of his life, when he would do reading events at various college campuses and other locations, he would always include 221B as part of his presentation. So folks got to hear Basil Rathbone read it, and somewhere on my site, I will send you the link to it. You can link to the post, which has a recording of Rathbone reading it, so that people can hear it for themselves.
That would be marvelous. We'll be right back after this brief word from our sponsor.
Here in the ancient Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Wessex, we are still getting over the untimely death of Eloise, beloved of Abelard, in 1163. We've raised our spirits by playing Kiss in the Ring and Thread My Needle. But you don't need cheering up, because you have your copy of A Curious Collection of Dates Through the Year with Sherlock Holmes by Leah Gwynn and Jamie Mahoney. It highlights every day with significant events from the Sherlockian universe. Available right now from our WessexPress.com. That Eden where the immortal brave dwell in a land serene, whose towers beyond the shining wave at sunset oft are seen. Find your own garden of delight with the pleasures only a new book from the Wessex Press can provide. Choose yours today.
We're talking with Ray Betzner, the proprietor and editor and chief cook and bottle washer at vincentstarrett.com. Ray, we were just talking about Starrett's legacy with 221B. What do you think Starrett would have made of the current world of Sherlock Holmes associations? You know, we've got the BSI, which has really made a comeback in the last couple of decades in terms of its publishing sensibilities. We have science societies all over the world. We have a renewed interest in Sherlock Holmes from every medium you can think of. How do you think Starrett would have made sense of all of this?
I don't know that anyone can make sense of all of it, but I'd like to think that he would have been delighted by it all, and to think that he had a hand in creating it. Really, when you go back and take a look at the early history of the Baker Street Irregulars and what I call the Sherlock Holmes movement in the United States, he planted the seed. His book, The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes, was instrumental in bringing together disparate individuals who thought they were the only ones especially in the United States, who felt about Sherlock Holmes, Dr. Watson, and the adventures in a particular kind of way. And they read that book and they said to themselves, "My gosh, there's somebody else who feels this way I wonder if there are others. And they would write to Vincent Starrett, and he would say, yes, there are others. As he became better acquainted with folks like Chris Morley, and that's how Edgar Smith got involved.
Right.
Edgar wrote a letter to Starrett that said, "I really liked your book. Now let me write several pages explaining why you're wrong in all of these things that you wrote." But it's a friendly letter. It's a lovely letter, but it's clear that Edgar had thought about these things very deeply too, and he simply disagreed on a couple of points that Starrett articulated in his book. But it was Starrett said, "Oh yes, by the way, you're in New York. There's this fellow in New York by the name of Chris Morley. The two of you should meet." And I'm paraphrasing, and perhaps Edgar would have run across Morley in some other kind of way too. But Starrett was a linchpin there, and there's no doubt about the fact that he helped popularize the notion of treating Holmes and Watson as real life individuals. He wasn't the first by any means, but he did, as I've said before, he taught us how to talk about Holmes and Watson while retaining that childlike wonder without being childish. And so I think that's the sweet spot. I think if he were still around and he saw people still doing that, he would be quite proud.
Yeah. Well, I think that is very much the spirit of what you've captured on the blog. I think there's a childlike sense of wonder of the dates and the publications that you're talking about. You also managed to have a fairly regimented and regular publishing schedule. I have to make the obvious tie to Starrett and his weekly columns. You're very much in the spirit of keeping alive his newspaperman kind of approach.
When I first started, I tried to create a volume of material there that so if people came to the site, there would be 3 or 4 posts there. They wouldn't just think that it was a one shot deal. But so it's lately come to every month to 6 weeks I post something new. But every once in a while I get into the mood. So just like over the Memorial Day weekend on Saturday, Sunday, and Monday, I posted a trilogy dedicated to the relationship between Charles Hauntz, who was a writer and editor for the Associated Press, and who was Vincent Starrett's bibliographer, and Starrett. So you got 3 for the price of 1, and it's largely because I couldn't stop myself once I got started.
Nothing wrong with that. Charles Hauntz is an interesting individual as well. I mean, talk about another newspaper man who was steeped in the lore of Holmesiana and who was also a writer outside of the news industry and a very bookish fellow himself. I would imagine there are a number of parallels there you could go down.
Sure. I mean, there's no doubt about the fact that he and Starrett shared this empathy for their professions, and it was Hauntz who, working for the Associated Press out of Chicago, came to realize that writing feature stories about literary works, especially, for example, on the birthdays of the authors or on the anniversaries of the first publications of some of these famous books, could actually turn into very well-read feature stories that would be extremely popular. And so he started with a piece on the anniversary of the Pickwick Papers and then went to the 50th anniversary of Sherlock Holmes, where he talked a little bit with Starrett, but also interviewed Frederick Dorr Steele for the piece, and used Freddie Steele's image of Sherlock Holmes, looking through his magnifying glass at a small image of Frederick Dorr Steele as an illustration for the story itself. So. And that was the first of his pieces about Holmes, and he wrote about Holmes in various ways for the next 20 years or so, and quite successfully. Eventually became a member of the Baker Street Irregulars.
Yeah. Just, and again, I mean, you talk about going down a rabbit hole. You know, I am sure you could do equal, if not more, justice to Charles Hantz and you know, his works and his correspondence and all the rest, as you've done to Vincent Starrett.
Yeah. Oh, sure. And you know, someone should do that. You know, someone should do that. Someone should start a. You know, I've been chiding Steve Rothman that he hasn't done something similar with Chris Morley. But he has this quarterly thing that he does called the Baker Street Journal that seems to keep him busy. I think capturing those things and, you know, and giving them a place, I don't know how permanent blogs are, but, you know, at least a semi-permanent residency so that people can take a look at them and enjoy them and, you know, talk about them. And perhaps spark other ideas. That would be grand. I think if there were, you know, 2 or 3 or more blogs that were similar to that, I would delight for it. And I do enjoy reading other people's blogs. I mean, they talk about Sherlock Holmes in other kinds of ways. Sure. I love it when I can sit down and take a look at what they find their passionate is, where their passions are.
Yeah. When you think about the collection of Starrett's materials that you have accumulated over this course of the last few decades, as you've narrowed your collection, have there been any major surprises to you, discoveries? I mean, I'm not talking about like the Vancouver bookshop incident, but have there been things that you have uncovered or instances in Starrett's life, perhaps, that have popped out to you that weren't previously known?
There's a piece that he wrote, a very sentimental piece that he wrote called "Snow for Christmas," and it has no Sherlock Holmes relevance, but it is the story of a man and his wife. It's Christmas Eve. There's a tremendous snowstorm coming. It's terrible. He apparently falls asleep. There's a knock at the door after his wife has gone up to bed, and he opens it up, and there's a delivery man there who and they have an odd conversation that seems completely kind of out of context until you realize that he's actually speaking to his dead father. I read that many years ago and didn't quite get it, but it wasn't until I went back and learned about his relationship with his father, a very loving relationship that he had with his father, that it became clear that although his father had passed away a couple of decades before, he still very much missed the man. And that was a bit of a revelation for me. He was not well known as a poet, but he always considered that to be kind of his first profession and his first love. Huh. And while the only poem that we know of, or people know of today, is 221B, he wrote many, many, many other pieces of poetry. Some of them describing his relationship with other characters out of fiction. But he wanted to be known as a poet in his early life. And you know, he failed. There's a picture that he has of himself, a photograph that was done, I think when he was in his 30s or so, and he's looking, you know, kind of sadly off into and down, and he describes it. You know, this is a photograph of me looking like a dying poet. Dying poets tend to become very well known. This fate has eluded me. So yeah, you know, I really didn't appreciate the fact that he wrote so much poetry. That was a big surprise. He has an early book of fantasy that is really, in my opinion, quite entertaining that nobody knows about. It's called Seaports in the Moon. It was the first kind of piece of fiction that was published in between hardcovers, and it is this fantastical story of the Fountain of Youth, and how a vial of water from the Fountain of Youth descends from one famous individual to another. And he does what so many others have done since, which is he combines historical figures with those from the same time frame who lived in literature, and has them interacting with one another. And it's a fun little book. He really had much higher hopes for it, that he would become, very well known. It didn't sell well, and he never went back to that genre again. Huh. But he's a far more multifaceted writer than most people know, and I think that discovery has been one of the big surprises to me. He wrote a children's book,
really?
A book that was illustrated by the same guy who illustrated the Freddy the Pig stories. He wrote, of course, books about books and about writing. He edited this book, clearly was looking, needed money at the time, as he so often did. And it's called what is it called here? A modern book of wonders. And it's part of part of a Funk and Wagnall series, called the Wonder Books. It's an odd little volume. It's mostly kind of things that were clipped out of newspapers that he wrote, photographs that clipped out of newspapers that he wrote little stories about. So there's a much greater variety to him. And, he also earned a tremendous amount of money in his early years writing mystery short stories, often featuring a character by the name of Jimmy Lavender, who was his modern contemporary Chicago version of Sherlock Holmes. And then he wrote a series of mystery novels with a couple of different detectives in them. Most of them are unknown today, and perhaps justifiably so. They aren't the kind of stories that would be appealing to a modern audience. They're very much of their time.
Interesting. Well, you mentioned recently that you are on a summer hiatus from the blog. You're going into reruns. So, as they used to say on NBC in the 1980s, if you haven't seen it before, it's new to you. Marvelous bit of advertising there. Where do you see the next year or three of studies in Starrett going?
So the big project which I always do, I come up with these ideas, and about 2/3 of the way I think to myself, why in the heck did I ever start this? The big project last year was a long series of posts that delved very deeply into the publication history of the private life of Sherlock Holmes. And it literally started from his first article that he ever wrote about Sherlock Holmes, and showed its development into the book and its various publications, and then how he came to revise the book in the 1960s and its publication then, and then how others have published the book and taken it forward from there. That, didn't quite drive me crazy, because there are many who will say I've already driven that route, but it was a pretty big undertaking. I think so. There's one other thing that I want to do. I've done it for a talk before, but I've never actually sat down and written it for something that could be published online or otherwise, and that is the full history of the poem 221B, along the lines that you and I talked about. That would take several posts to do it justice, I think, and it would be, but it would be fun, and I think it would be something that people could also relate to, since so many people know the poem.
Yeah, no, I think that would be very, very well received, and I think folks would really appreciate learning more about how we got these 14 or so lines of poetry that are really immortal.
Yeah.
Wow.
They really are a unifier. I mean, there are so many different variations on Holmes, interpretations of him, but I think if people have a kind of that love for Sherlock Holmes in their heart, they find common ground in that sonnet.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, the blog is called Studies in Starrett. You can find it at vincentstarrett.com. You can find Ray, of course, writing there, as well as, what else am I missing, Ray?
There's also a Studies in Starrett Facebook page where I use that to largely advertise what's going on at the blog, or what is new in the collection that you might eventually see in the blog.
Perfect. Well, we will have all of those links in the show notes. Ray, thank you once again for joining us here, and we look forward to reading more that pours out of your keyboard onto vincentstarrett.com.
Scott, as always, it's a pleasure. I really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you so much for the opportunity to talk about Starrett. And if you ever see Bert Wolder again, please give him my best.
Well, it's great to hear Ray, and these kinds of enthusiasms. There are people who, and Ray is like that, in his way. There are people who are like Sherpas or like guides. When you come across their writing, when you come across their interest, they lead you on to other interesting people. Christopher Morley was like that. He wrote so many essays about the writers he admired, and then you can go look up the writers. But Starrett, too, was... as Ray sort of presented, a great connector. He was part of this great newspaper circle in Chicago in the early part of the 19th century. And then, he himself had made a great contribution to literary history in a way in facilitating the discovery of Tamerlane, of a copy of Tamerlane in Edgar Allan Poe's first book, which is a lot of fun. So I love how all these things are connected.
Yeah. And I had the great fortune of being with Ray when the two of us visited the Poe exhibit at the Getty Library and Museum in New York some years ago.
Oh, and that was the Morgan.
Sorry, the Morgan. Yep. Getty, Morgan, they're all the same. But they had an original Tamerlane on display there, and of course Starrett wrote the famous "Have you a Tamerlane in your attic?" One of the entries that is part of the Studies in Starrett blog collection. So nice to round that out.
Not too many people know that one of the people who responded to that question of Starrett's, "Have you a Tamerlane in the attic?" wrote back and said, "Yes, but I've called the exterminator."
Well, speaking of finding things in attics, here to tell us about some of the findings that he has unearthed of publications past is none other than Mattias Boström with one of his As We Go to Press entries.
The press is a very valuable institution if one knows how to use it.
Read all about it. Telegraph! Westminster murder! Read all about it. Telegraph! Read all about it. Westminster murder!
I must make something of it, although I've no doubt that every newspaper in London will be on the street with a full and detailed account.
As we go to press, sensational developments have been reported.
This is As We Go to Press with Mattias Boström. This time the random date generator gave me 18th of July 1964. I searched the newspaper archives for Sherlock Holmes related material, and I found a short notice in the Hartford Courant, Connecticut. The headline is Communist Detective Story. And once more we get proof that Sherlock Holmes always has been big behind the Iron Curtain. I mean, we already know that the people in the Soviet Union loved Holmes and had done so since the beginning of the 20th century. And the man with the twisted lip was even a part of the standard library for the Red Army soldiers. And they made a fantastic TV series about Sherlock Holmes in the 1980s. But the text in the Hartford Courant mentions another country where Holmes was a natural thing to refer to. There had been a writers' convention in East Berlin, during which the crime authors in the communist East Germany had been told to dream up a socialist Sherlock Holmes. The official Communist Party newspaper Neues Deutschland had reported about it, and the news had reached Hartford in Connecticut. The Hartford Courant writes, "The spirit of the famous detective created by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle should be revived in the person of a far-sighted, wise officer of the People's Police. Stories about this new super detective must, however, have a socialist moral. They must not describe crimes that can be imitated, but instead contribute to reduction of crime. Crimes committed in West Germany could, however, be described, according to Neues Deutschland, so as to expose the way the West German police apparatus operates in the interest of the imperialist state." It's interesting to see how Sherlock Holmes always is such a natural part of culture and common life. It's almost as if there exists only one detective.
Always a delight to hear from Mattias and his unique finds from the annals of newspapers long lost and once again found. Well, we are finding ourselves in the midst of Canonical Couplets. That's right, that's everyone's favorite Sherlockian quiz program, where we pose to you a 2-line poem and you identify which story in the Sherlock Holmes canon it refers to. You'll recall the last time we put this in front of you. The best and wisest man I ever knew still had, apparently, a trick or two. Bert, do you know which story that referred to?
Yes, that is the case that Holmes investigated involving a patisserie, I think, in France, and it was called The Adventure of the Final Pie Tin, wasn't it?
How positively pasty of you. No, it is the final problem. The final problem.
I was so close.
And this one tripped people up a bit. There were a few entries where people said the empty house, where, that would make sense, kind of from a retrospective perspective. But you'll remember that in episode 166, we included the empty house. That was, the couplet there was, the death of an adventuresome young rake established Watson's paramount mistake. And of course it was Adair. So, you gotta pay attention, people. You gotta keep close tabs on this stuff. And in this case, we did have a handful of, correct entries, so we're gonna go ahead and spin the big prize wheel and, vamp a little bit as it continues to roll around there, slows down a little bit, and lands on Rich Jones Jr. Rich, congratulations. We will get our prize to you. We'll make arrangements with you and see what we can get you from the iHost vaults. And now, for those of you looking to try your luck, once again, pay close attention here, because here is this episode's Canonical Couplet. There isn't anybody of that name, but David told the story just the same. If you think you know the answer, jot it down, send it to us at comment@ihearofsherlock.com, put the subject line Canonical Couplet, and if your answer is chosen from among the correct answers, you can win a prize. Good luck. Whew. How about that?
Very good.
Yeah. Well, I guess we'll be back here in 2 weeks' time as we round the corner to June. June is indeed busting out all over. We'll see who we have with us that time around. We've got a remarkable number of shows set up for the second half of the year. So we welcome you as a subscriber. Just make sure you're subscribed on whatever platform provider of choice you have, or head over to ihearofsherlock.com and get those email updates from us. Until next time, I am Scott Monty.
And I am Bert Wolder.
And we're thankful for that. As together, we say, The game's afoot.
The game's afoot.
I'm afraid that in the pleasure of this conversation, I am neglecting business of importance, which awaits me elsewhere.
Thank you for listening. Please be sure to join us again for the next episode of I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, the first podcast dedicated to Sherlock Holmes.
Goodbye, and good luck, and believe me to be, my dear fellow, very sincerely yours, Sherlock Holmes.